I paused, examining and analyzing all the minutiae of causation, as exemplified in the change from life to death and death to life, until from the midst of this darkness a sudden light broke in upon me, a light so brilliant and wondrous, yet so simple, that while I became dizzy with the immensity of the prospect which it illustrated, I was surprised that among so many men of genius, who had directed their inquiries towards the same science, that I alone should be reserved to discover so astonishing a secret. That was Victor Frankenstein discovering the secret of life and the secret of creating life. Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I are here today to talk about this essential classic of horror, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Published in 1818, this novel is considered by many to be the first real science fiction novel, and it could be that, although it is certainly a giant in the genre of horror fiction. It's hard to imagine horror fiction without Frankenstein. This casts a giant shadow all across horror. Written by young Mary Shelley, she came up with an incredible story. A story that's about a lot of things. But today, Roger and I are going to be concentrating on the horror aspect of this story. And it is definitely a horror story. The story of a man who creates a monster. Everybody knows Frankenstein. Everybody knows the name Frankenstein, even though many people erroneously believe the name Frankenstein belongs to the monster and not to the creator of the monster. Nevertheless, most people know Frankenstein, and most people know what Frankenstein is about. Largely, I think, due to the films, there have been hundreds of films that have been inspired by this story. And so when people think of Frankenstein, they usually think of some version of the monster as performed by Boris Karloff in that original Frankenstein movie, which was a great movie. And its sequel, Bride of Frankenstein, was a genuine masterpiece. It's no wonder that most people think of that version of Frankenstein. That version of Frankenstein performed by Boris Karloff was not too intelligent, but definitely a character we could sympathize with. That version of Frankenstein was an innocent, thrust into a world that didn't understand him and was terrified of him and treated him pretty badly. The monster in this book, when he first is created, is definitely an innocent. He becomes a genuine monster, though, and a terrifying one. This story is fascinating for a lot of reasons. It is the story of the dangers of ambition, for one thing. And we see that early on in the story. Frankenstein just becomes fascinated by science and the idea of life and how does life exist. And once he learns the secret, he becomes determined to create life. Now, how is he going to go about doing this? What is he going to create? Well, nothing less than another human being will do. So he decides to create his own human being. We originally find Frankenstein in this story. He is found by Captain Walton, who is making a trip to the North Pole. He is another obsessed character. He has great ambition, and he's driven by his need to, make great discoveries in his journey to the North Pole. Frankenstein is pursuing his monster at this point, but he's almost dead from doing it. He's physically exhausted, and Captain Walton brings Frankenstein onto his ship so that Frankenstein can recover. And while Frankenstein is on the ship, Frankenstein narrates his story to the captain. Later on in this story, the monster narrates his story to Frankenstein, who then narrates it to Captain Walton. It's a story within a story within a story. The creation of this monster is really interesting. We have an idea in our heads, most of us, about the creation of Frankenstein. Again, most of this comes from that old Universal movie. That initial scene in that movie, the creation scene, was brilliant, and it's been copied over and over again in other Frankenstein movies in one way or another. But the actual creation of Frankenstein is a mystery. Victor Frankenstein has suffered so much from his discovery and his experiment gone wrong that he doesn't dare let anybody else know how he did what he did. So when he's talking to Captain Walton wants to know, hey, how'd you do this? Frankenstein will not tell him. And thus, we don't know exactly how he created the monster. He has the secret to creating life. Now, we know the materials that he used to create the monster because he mentioned them. He goes to, graveyards and other places where he could be supplied with bodies and parts of bodies. It gives you the idea that it was kind of disgusting what he had to go through to create the monster, but we never actually know how he did it because we don't know even how he animates this monster, how he gives this monster life. He decides to make the monster a really big guy because he thinks that this will simplify the creation of the monster itself. Again, from the movies, we mostly have an idea of Frankenstein taking hunks and chunks of dead bodies, sewing them together, and then animating it with electricity. But we don't know that's how he did it. We don't know that he used these materials as he describes them. We don't know that he sews them together. We don't know how he does it. All we know is that he takes a bunch of dead bodies, somehow makes a giant monster out of them, and then gives this monster life. We don't really get any of the details. And then when he's creating this monster, he's becoming physically exhausted. This is a lot of work, creating a monster. But it's only when he actually gives this thing life that he realizes what he's really done. Here's one of the interesting things about the monster. There's something wrong with this thing even existing. And that is what really inspires the terror in everybody who sees this thing. He is ugly. And Frankenstein says in this book, he was ugly when I was making him. But once he was alive, he was just the most ghastly thing ever. Because there's something wrong with this thing even existing. I get the sense that it's sort of like the uncanny valley effect that we sometimes get when we watch films with badly CGI'd people, when you just look at it and it's like, well, that's wrong. I get the sense that's kind of what's going on with the Frankenstein's monster. Because just his appearance, as big and hideous as he is, doesn't seem to me to be enough to cause the horror that people have when they just look at him. There's something else going on with this thing. He is the thing that should not be, the monster that should not exist. And that's something people recognize right away when they see him. That's part of the horror. But the monster himself, he isn't innocent. When he is created, he is abandoned by his creator. Frankenstein takes one look at this monster, realizes what he's done, and is terrified and bolts out of the room. The monster knows nothing. He's a blank slate. We don't know, because we don't know how Frankenstein created the monster. We don't know whether he just has had a brain kind of inserted into his head like we normally see in the Frankenstein movies. We don't know if he had a new brain that was grown. We don't know how this monster was created. But he seems to be a completely blank slate. He's born basically as an 8-foot tall adult. He wanders out of the room, manages to put a coat on his way out, and then he's left on his own. And he has some experiences which he narrates. But the thing about this monster is that he is a very intelligent creature. He learns fast, and he learns quite quickly that he is different from everybody else. He doesn't have any evil intentions, and this is part of the tragedy of the story. He didn't have to be the monster that he became. If Frankenstein had stayed, if Frankenstein didn't run out of the room, if Frankenstein had helped this creature and educated it, there's no reason that he would have ever become the thing that he became. But he did. He educates himself mostly by spying on some people in a cottage. But he learns to read, he learns to write, he learns to speak. And he learns of his origin because of some notes that are left in the jacket of this coat that he stole. So he learns the name of Frankenstein. And he figures out, what happened? Frankenstein is his creator, and Frankenstein abandoned him. And he will have his revenge. He figures if he cannot be accepted by human beings, and he's not, everybody who sees him runs away, he gets shot at, he actually gets shot. He figures, I'm going to have my revenge on the world, and I'm going to have my revenge on Frankenstein. And that's where the real horror in the story happens. Frankenstein, by the time he created his monster, was quite ill, actually. He was feverish. This doesn't entirely excuse his actions, but in a way we can kind of understand. He wasn't well, and it takes him a while to recover. He's quite relieved when he gets back home and the monster's gone. He comes upon his best friend Clerval, who helps him recover, and he goes home, only to discover that his young brother is missing. And actually, his young brother has been murdered. He had gone missing, and then he was discovered murdered. And a young woman who was a friend of the family has been accused of the murder. Frankenstein knows right away that this is the work of his monster. He had seen his monster at one point, and he figures out the monster did this. And this is the part where the monster becomes a real monster. I'm giving plenty of spoilers for this, but, kind of need to talk about this, because it is when the Frankenstein's creature murders a child, an innocent child, strictly to get vengeance on Frankenstein. That's when he really becomes a monster. Anything good that he could have been is pretty much lost at that point. And he makes a demand of Frankenstein when Frankenstein finally catches up to him. He says, you know what? I'm this way because I'm wretched, because I'm lonely. I'm the only one of my kind on earth. Make me a friend, a companion. Make a female monster, and we can run off together, and we won't bother anyone ever again. If you don't, I'm going to just, kill everybody. So, do what I say. Actually, he doesn't say that. He doesn't threaten to kill everybody. But Frankenstein believes that his threat is that if he doesn't do this thing, the monster will kill him. He thinks he's the target of the monster, when he really should have known better. He decides he will help this monster, and he will make a female version of the monster for the monster. So the monster will go away and not bother anyone ever again. But now he believes that if he does this, instead of just one horrible creature, now there's two, and they could breed and create a whole race of monsters. And you might think, well, when you created the female monster, couldn't you just make it so she was, so she wouldn't be able to have children? I mean, you're making it. Couldn't you make that alteration? We don't know, because remember, we don't know how the monster was really created in the first place. So we don't know, I guess. Maybe there's just no way to create this monster exactly as he wants to, as a sterile monster that will not breed a race of monsters. So he's worried that, by doing this, he could create a race of horrible creatures that will overrun the world, which is, a pretty grim possibility. So at the last minute, he destroys his work, royally pissing off our monster. And the monster has his horrific revenge by basically killing everybody that Frankenstein loves and tormenting Frankenstein. And this is the really horrifying part of this story, is that Frankenstein, through his ambition to create life, has created he's created this horrific thing that ruins his life. This monster that stalks him and stalks everybody that he loves, and is unstoppable. There's a lot more to this story. Originally, when I read this story, I was very sympathetic towards the monster, and I still am to a point. And Frankenstein sort of seems like the ultimate deadbeat dad. But recently, when I read this story again, I was much more sympathetic to the character of Frankenstein. And he makes mistakes, and he doesn't live up to his obvious responsibilities. There are several points in this story where he doesn't. And so you might think he would be a hard man to sympathize with, but I do, just because of everything that he goes through. There are two versions of this story out there that you can pick up in book form. There's the original 1818 edition, and there's a revised edition from 1831. The 1831 is the one that we usually find available if you just get some random edition of Frankenstein. It's usually the 1831 edition of Frankenstein that we find. That was Mary Shelley's last word on the subject of Frankenstein. That was her final revision. And so that's the version we usually get. However, it is the 1818 version that is finding more favor now, and I think correctly. The 1818 version it's true to the original vision of Mary Shelley when she wrote the story. When she revised the story, she was quite a different person. She had experienced a lot more. She had experienced crushing loss. And she was certainly at a different place in her life. Her political ideas had changed. Her ideas about a lot of things had changed. And that is reflected in the story. Frankenstein, the original version, Frankenstein as a character has a lot more agency and free will. He could have made different decisions than he did, and that is more clear in the original version of the story. By 1831, Mary Shelley sort of looked at herself as a victim of fate in a lot of ways. And that is reflected in her revisions in Frankenstein. Frankenstein becomes a victim of fate. He was doomed from the start to this outcome. He could never have altered this outcome, really, because this was just what was going to happen. There are changes in this novel that kind of illustrate that. There were other changes, some like the character of Elizabeth in the original version was Victor Frankenstein's cousin. She changes that so that now she's no longer his cousin, but she's the daughter of a friend of Frankenstein's father who he was raised with. There are differences, there are other differences. There are differences in the character of Clerval, where Clerval in the newer edition becomes just as ambitious as Frankenstein, only in another way and towards other ends, where he wasn't like that in the original version. The 1831 book is in some ways a darker story. There are a lot of changes, and in this Norton Critical Edition, it has a chart that'll list all the changes, where you have an original version here and the revised version over here, and it'll just show you all the changes that were made in the novel. You see over here there's a lot more text because Mary Shelley added quite a bit to the story. I don't think it makes it a better story. It makes it a different story. And it's good to know that going in. It's one of those weird situations where you have the author of a story revising her own work, which she had every right to do, of course. It's her book. But she was essentially a different person by the time she wrote it, or by the time she revised it. And so in many ways, it seems like a different book in certain ways. It's still Frankenstein. The story is still the same, basically. The same things happen in the story. But some of the focus has changed. And definitely, it does make all the characters in this book much more the victims of fate. These things were just going to happen. I still prefer the 1818 text, and like I said, that is the text that is more in favor nowadays. Although, if you have either version is certainly worth a read. It's probably best to read both. There are a lot of editions of Frankenstein out there. This is a very good one. This is like I said, the Norton Critical Edition of the 1818 text with all of the changes listed in one of the appendixes. But the version I think is the best is this one. This is the New Annotated Frankenstein by Leslie S. Klinger. Again, we have the 1818 text. All the changes are listed, but it has a bunch of other stuff. So this story, published in 1818, it was a different time. And this volume in the annotations, it really gives you an idea of what it was like at the time when Mary Shelley wrote this, where she was at in her life when she wrote this, what the recent scientific discoveries were when she wrote the initial version of this story. It just has a ton of valuable information. This is a great book to have. And if you're approaching the story for the first time, a lot of those notes are helpful. And so I highly recommend this one. I guess that's all I have to say about Frankenstein today. Roger has nothing to add. I will catch you next time.